The evening sun was sinking behind the distant red mountains when Elias, a lone Apache human traveler, finally reached the small frontier settlement of Red Creek. Dust clung to his boots, his dark coat was faded from years of travel, and his horse was nearly as tired as he was. He had spent the last 3 weeks crossing the wilderness, following old trails that most settlers no longer used. All Elias wanted that night was a warm meal, a quiet corner, and a few hours of rest. Red Creek had only one proper tavern, a wooden building called the Golden Spur. Elias pushed open the swinging doors and stepped inside. The room was warm and crowded, filled with the smell of roasted meat, fresh bread, and strong coffee. Conversations filled the air as ranchers, miners, and travelers gathered around rough wooden tables. Elias found an empty seat near the fireplace and ordered a simple dinner. While waiting, he noticed something unusual through the tavern window. A figure stood alone outside. She was an orc woman. Her greenish-gray skin was covered with dust, her long dark hair was tangled, and her clothes were worn almost beyond repair. She looked exhausted. One hand rested against the tavern wall as though she needed it to remain standing. But what caught Elias's attention most was her expression. She was hungry. Not simply a little hungry, but desperately hungry. The orc woman stared through the window at the tables filled with food. Her eyes followed every plate that passed by. Yet she did not enter. Several customers noticed her too. A few laughed. One man whispered something cruel to his companion, and they both looked toward the door. The orc lowered her head. Elias watched silently. He had seen fear before. He had seen pride. He had seen people treated badly because they were different. But there was something about this woman's expression that stayed with him. His meal arrived. A large plate of roasted venison, potatoes, bread, and beans was placed before him. Elias looked down at the food, then back toward the window. The orc woman was still there. For several moments, neither moved. Then, slowly, she pushed open the tavern door. The room became strangely quiet. Every eye turned toward her. She stopped just inside the doorway. Her shoulders tightened as she looked around at the staring faces. Elias could see that she wanted to run. Instead, she took one hesitant step forward. Then another. Finally, she approached Elias's table. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Can I eat with you?" Elias looked at her. The entire tavern seemed to be waiting for his answer. The orc woman expected rejection. Perhaps she had heard the same cruel words too many times to believe anything else was possible. But Elias did something that surprised everyone. He immediately moved his plate to the center of the table. Then he pulled out the empty chair beside him. "Of course," he said simply. "Sit down." The orc stared at him. Elias frowned gently. "You don't have to ask permission to eat when you're hungry." For the first time that night, the fear in her eyes disappeared. She slowly sat down. And as Elias pushed the bread toward her, he realized that the woman before him was carrying a story far heavier than the hunger in her stomach. The evening sun was sinking behind the distant red mountains when Elias, a lone Apache human traveler, finally reached the small frontier settlement of Red Creek. Dust clung to his boots, his dark coat was faded from years of travel, and his horse was nearly as tired as he was. He had spent the last 3 weeks crossing the wilderness, following old trails that most settlers no longer used. All Elias wanted that night was a warm meal, a quiet corner, and a few hours of rest. Red Creek had only one proper tavern, a wooden building called the Golden Spur. Elias pushed open the swinging doors and stepped inside. The room was warm and crowded, filled with the smell of roasted meat, fresh bread, and strong coffee. Conversations filled the air as ranchers, miners, and travelers gathered around rough wooden tables. Elias found an empty seat near the fireplace and ordered a simple dinner. While waiting, he noticed something unusual through the tavern window. A figure stood alone outside. She was an orc woman. Her greenish-gray skin was covered with dust, her long dark hair was tangled, and her clothes were worn almost beyond repair. She looked exhausted. One hand rested against the tavern wall as though she needed it to remain standing. But what caught Elias's attention most was her expression. She was hungry. Not simply a little hungry, but desperately hungry. The orc woman stared through the window at the tables filled with food. Her eyes followed every plate that passed by. Yet she did not enter. Several customers noticed her too. A few laughed. One man whispered something cruel to his companion, and they both looked toward the door. The orc lowered her head. Elias watched silently. He had seen fear before. He had seen pride. He had seen people treated badly because they were different. But there was something about this woman's expression that stayed with him. His meal arrived. A large plate of roasted venison, potatoes, bread, and beans was placed before him. Elias looked down at the food, then back toward the window. The orc woman was still there. For several moments, neither moved. Then, slowly, she pushed open the tavern door. The room became strangely quiet. Every eye turned toward her. She stopped just inside the doorway. Her shoulders tightened as she looked around at the staring faces. Elias could see that she wanted to run. Instead, she took one hesitant step forward. Then another. Finally, she approached Elias's table. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Can I eat with you?" Elias looked at her. The entire tavern seemed to be waiting for his answer. The orc woman expected rejection. Perhaps she had heard the same cruel words too many times to believe anything else was possible. But Elias did something that surprised everyone. He immediately moved his plate to the center of the table. Then he pulled out the empty chair beside him. "Of course," he said simply. "Sit down." The orc stared at him. Elias frowned gently. "You don't have to ask permission to eat when you're hungry." For the first time that night, the fear in her eyes disappeared. She slowly sat down. And as Elias pushed the bread toward her, he realized that the woman before him was carrying a story far heavier than the hunger in her stomach. The evening sun was sinking behind the distant red mountains when Elias, a lone Apache human traveler, finally reached the small frontier settlement of Red Creek. Dust clung to his boots, his dark coat was faded from years of travel, and his horse was nearly as tired as he was. He had spent the last 3 weeks crossing the wilderness, following old trails that most settlers no longer used. All Elias wanted that night was a warm meal, a quiet corner, and a few hours of rest. Red Creek had only one proper tavern, a wooden building called the Golden Spur. Elias pushed open the swinging doors and stepped inside. The room was warm and crowded, filled with the smell of roasted meat, fresh bread, and strong coffee. Conversations filled the air as ranchers, miners, and travelers gathered around rough wooden tables. Elias found an empty seat near the fireplace and ordered a simple dinner. While waiting, he noticed something unusual through the tavern window. A figure stood alone outside. She was an orc woman. Her greenish-gray skin was covered with dust, her long dark hair was tangled, and her clothes were worn almost beyond repair. She looked exhausted. One hand rested against the tavern wall as though she needed it to remain standing. But what caught Elias's attention most was her expression. She was hungry. Not simply a little hungry, but desperately hungry. The orc woman stared through the window at the tables filled with food. Her eyes followed every plate that passed by. Yet she did not enter. Several customers noticed her too. A few laughed. One man whispered something cruel to his companion, and they both looked toward the door. The orc lowered her head. Elias watched silently. He had seen fear before. He had seen pride. He had seen people treated badly because they were different. But there was something about this woman's expression that stayed with him. His meal arrived. A large plate of roasted venison, potatoes, bread, and beans was placed before him. Elias looked down at the food, then back toward the window. The orc woman was still there. For several moments, neither moved. Then, slowly, she pushed open the tavern door. The room became strangely quiet. Every eye turned toward her. She stopped just inside the doorway. Her shoulders tightened as she looked around at the staring faces. Elias could see that she wanted to run. Instead, she took one hesitant step forward. Then another. Finally, she approached Elias's table. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Can I eat with you?" Elias looked at her. The entire tavern seemed to be waiting for his answer. The orc woman expected rejection. Perhaps she had heard the same cruel words too many times to believe anything else was possible. But Elias did something that surprised everyone. He immediately moved his plate to the center of the table. Then he pulled out the empty chair beside him. "Of course," he said simply. "Sit down." The orc stared at him. Elias frowned gently. "You don't have to ask permission to eat when you're hungry." For the first time that night, the fear in her eyes disappeared. She slowly sat down. And as Elias pushed the bread toward her, he realized that the woman before him was carrying a story far heavier than the hunger in her stomach. The orc woman sat frozen in the chair, staring at the food Elias had pushed toward her. For several seconds, she did not move. The tavern had grown quiet again. Everyone seemed to be watching her, waiting to see what she would do. Elias noticed the way her fingers trembled beneath the table. "You can eat," he said gently. The woman looked at him. "Really?" Elias nodded. "Really?" She glanced at the food again. Then hunger overcame fear. She picked up a piece of bread and took a small bite. Almost immediately, she stopped. Her eyes widened. It was obvious that she had not tasted fresh bread in a very long time. Elias said nothing. He simply leaned back in his chair and allowed her to eat at her own pace. But after a few seconds, the orc woman began eating faster. She grabbed another piece of bread, then reached for the beans. Her hands shook as she tried to eat quickly, as though someone might suddenly take the plate away. Elias quietly pushed the entire plate toward her. "Take your time," he said. "No one's going to take it." The woman stopped chewing. She looked at him with suspicion. "No one. No one." Her eyes lowered. For some reason, those two words seemed to affect her more than the food. Elias noticed tears beginning to gather in her eyes, but she quickly turned her face away. "My name is Mira," she whispered. "I'm Elias." She nodded. For a while, the only sound between them was the clinking of utensils. When Mira finally finished eating, she carefully wiped her mouth with a cloth. She looked embarrassed by how quickly she had consumed the meal. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" "I ate too much." Elias stared at her. Then he gave a quiet laugh. "Mira, you just walked into a tavern looking like you haven't eaten properly in a week. You should have eaten more." She looked at him in disbelief. Elias raised his hand toward the tavern keeper. "Bring another plate." Mira immediately shook her head. "No." Elias looked at her. "I can't pay you. I didn't ask you to. I have nothing." "Then don't pay." Her expression changed. She studied him carefully, as though trying to discover the hidden reason behind his kindness. "You want something from me?" Elias's face became serious. "No." Mira looked away. That answer seemed to confuse her more than anything else. After a moment, Elias asked, "Who did this to you?" Mira's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "I don't know what you mean." "You're starving. You're afraid of everyone in this room. And you're dressed like you've been running for days." Mira remained silent. Elias did not pressure her. Finally, she whispered, "I was with traders." Elias's expression hardened. traders? Mira nodded slowly. They said I was worth something because I was strong. They took me from one settlement to another. I worked for them. Carried their supplies. Protected their wagons. Her voice trembled. Then one night, I escaped. Elias said nothing. I ran for 3 days, she continued. I thought they were behind me. I hid whenever I saw people. I was afraid someone would recognize me and send me back. She looked down at the empty plate. That is why I didn't come inside. Elias understood. She hadn't been afraid of the food. She had been afraid of people. Mira expected humans to hurt her. Instead, one had given her a seat. Elias leaned forward. You're safe here. Mira looked at him. Why? Elias thought about the question. Then he answered simply. Because you asked for food. Mira stared at him. Elias continued, and because anyone who is hungry deserves to eat. For the first time, Mira smiled. It was small and uncertain. But it was real. Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple meal was about to change both their lives forever. The next morning, Elias woke before sunrise. The golden spur was still quiet when he stepped outside. A cold wind moved through the empty streets of Red Creek, carrying dust across the wooden boardwalks. His horse stood tied beside the tavern, patiently waiting. Elias had barely finished saddling the animal when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Mira stood near the tavern door. She looked different. Her hair had been washed, her face was cleaner, and she was wearing an old brown coat the tavern keeper had given her. She still looked tired, but there was something new in her eyes. Hope. You're leaving, she said. Elias tightened the strap around his saddle. I have to. Mira looked toward the empty road. Where will you go? West. Why? Elias smiled faintly. Because that's where I'm headed. Mira looked down. For a moment, Elias thought she would say goodbye. Instead, she asked, Can I come with you? Elias stopped. He studied her carefully. Why? Mira hesitated. Because they will find me. Elias's expression became serious. Who? The traders. Before Elias could ask anything else, a sudden noise came from the far end of the street. Horses. Several of them. Myra's face instantly lost its color. She stepped backward. No. Elias turned toward the approaching riders. 4 men were entering the settlement. They wore dark coats and carried rifles. The man in front was broad-shouldered, with a thick black beard and a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. Mira immediately moved behind Elias. The riders stopped in front of the golden spur. The leader climbed down from his horse. His eyes searched the street. Then he saw Mira. A cruel smile appeared on his face. There you are. Mira grabbed the back of Elias's coat. Elias looked at her. You know him? Mira nodded. He's the leader. The man walked closer. Her name is Mira, he announced. She's stolen property. Elias's eyes narrowed. Myra's grip tightened. The leader pointed toward her. She belongs to us. Hand her over, and nobody gets hurt. The entire street had gone silent. People watched from windows and doorways, but nobody stepped forward. Elias looked at Mira. She was trembling. The same woman who had been brave enough to ask a stranger for food now looked terrified. Elias turned back toward the leader. She doesn't belong to anyone. The man's smile disappeared. You don't understand. No, Elias replied calmly. I understand perfectly. The leader stepped closer. She was purchased. Mira lowered her head. Elias's voice became colder. Then whoever sold her committed a crime. The man laughed. You think you can change the law? Elias looked around at the silent townspeople. No. His hand slowly moved toward the rifle resting against his saddle. But I can decide what I do. The leader's men reached for their weapons. Mira whispered, Elias, don't. He glanced back at her. Stay behind me. You don't know what they will do. Elias looked into her frightened eyes. I know exactly what they're doing. He turned toward the men. They're trying to make you afraid. The leader raised his rifle. Last chance. Elias stepped forward. No. The word echoed through the quiet street. The leader's face twisted with anger. But before he could react, Elias drew his weapon. Everything happened in an instant. The first shot struck the ground beside the leader's boot. The second shattered the rifle from one of his men's hands. The townspeople gasped. Elias did not fire to kill. He was sending a message. The leader stared at him. Elias's voice remained calm. Leave. The man looked at Mira. This isn't over. Mira finally stepped out from behind Elias. Her voice shook, but she spoke clearly. Yes, it is. The leader stared at her. Mira lifted her chin. I am not your property. For the first time, the man looked uncertain. Elias mounted his horse. Then he extended his hand toward Mira. She stared at it. Come on, he said. Mira looked back at the men who had once controlled her life. Then she looked at Elias. Slowly, she took his hand. Elias pulled her onto the horse behind him. As they rode away from Red Creek, Mira held tightly to his coat. Neither of them spoke. But deep inside, Mira understood something important. Elias had not saved her because she was an orc. He had not helped her because he wanted a reward. He had simply seen a hungry person sitting alone in the cold. And when the world tried to take that person away, he had refused to stand aside. For the first time in years, Mira allowed herself to believe that perhaps she was finally free. The road west of Red Creek was nothing like the roads Elias had traveled before. For 3 days, he and Mira moved through a harsh wilderness of red canyons, dry riverbeds, and towering mountains. They avoided the main trails whenever possible, knowing the traders would be searching for them. Elias rode during the day and camped beneath the stars at night. Mira stayed close. At first, neither of them spoke much. She was still learning how to trust him. Elias understood that. He never asked unnecessary questions. He never demanded to know every detail of her past. He simply made sure she had food, water, and a safe place to sleep. On the 4th morning, they reached a narrow canyon. Elias stopped his horse. Mira looked around. What is it? Elias studied the ground. Tracks. She climbed down and examined them. Horse tracks. 6 horses. Myra's face became tense. Elias nodded toward the trail. They're following us. Mira immediately reached for the knife at her belt. How far? Not far enough. They quickly moved deeper into the canyon. The walls rose high on both sides, leaving them with very few places to hide. Elias knew they couldn't stay there for long. Suddenly, an arrow struck the ground beside him. Mira ducked. They found us. Elias pulled her behind a large rock. More arrows flew through the air. Elias looked toward the cliffs. They're above us. Mira pointed toward a narrow passage. There. They ran. Elias fired toward the attackers while Mira moved ahead. But the canyon ended at a steep drop. They were trapped. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Mira looked at Elias. There are too many. Elias checked his rifle. Then we'll have to be clever. Before he could explain, a gunshot echoed. Elias suddenly stumbled. Mira gasped. Elias. He had been struck in the shoulder. He fell against the rocks. Mira immediately rushed toward him. I'm fine, he said. You've been shot. It's only my shoulder. The attackers appeared at the top of the canyon. The traitor leader looked down at them. It's over, Mira. She stood between Elias and the men. No. The leader laughed. You have nowhere to go. Mira looked around. Then she noticed something. A narrow ledge ran along the canyon wall. It was barely wide enough for one person. She turned to Elias. Can you climb? Elias looked at the ledge. With one good arm. Then follow me. Mira helped him stand. The two began climbing. The traitor's men fired again. Mira moved quickly, shielding Elias whenever possible. She knew the mountains better than the men chasing them. She had spent years traveling with traders, learning how to survive in places where one wrong step could mean death. They reached a narrow opening between two cliffs. Mira stopped. Wait. Elias leaned against the wall. What? She pointed toward the ground. A rope. Mira smiled. Elias understood. The traders had brought climbing equipment to cross the canyon earlier. Mira quickly tied the rope around a large rock and pulled it tight. Then she looked toward Elias. Go. You first. Mira shook her head. You're injured. I'm still faster. She stared at him. Even now, he was thinking about her safety before his own. Mira's expression softened. Then she climbed across. Halfway over, the rope suddenly slipped. Mira cried out. Elias grabbed the rope with his injured arm. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he refused to let go. Mira. She looked back. Keep moving. She reached the other side. Then she pulled the rope tight and helped Elias cross. When they finally reached safety, both collapsed against the rocks. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Mira began laughing. Elias stared at her. What? She shook her head. Nothing. You're laughing while we're being hunted. Mira smiled. I just realized something. What? You're terrible at running away. Elias gave her an amused look. And you're terrible at following instructions. Mira laughed again. It was the first time Elias had heard her laugh. The sound surprised him. For so long, Mira had been frightened, hungry, and hunted. Now, for just a moment, she seemed like a normal young woman enjoying a joke with a friend. But their moment of peace did not last. That evening, they found shelter inside an abandoned mountain cabin. Elias's shoulder was badly bruised, but the bullet had only grazed him. Mira carefully cleaned the wound. You saved me today, Elias said. Mira looked up. You saved me first. That was different. How? Elias thought for a moment. You needed help. Mira tied the bandage. So did you. Elias looked at her. Neither spoke. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains. For the first time, Elias realized that Mira was no longer simply the frightened orc woman he had met outside a tavern. She was becoming his companion. His equal. His friend. And perhaps something more. Mira looked toward the small fire. I used to think humans hated orcs. Elias raised an eyebrow. Some do. She looked at him. Do you? Elias shook his head. I don't hate people because of what they were born as. Mira smiled faintly. Then what do you judge them by? Elias looked into the fire. By what they choose to become. Mira remained silent. Those words stayed with her long after Elias fell asleep. Because she had spent years believing she was nothing more than what others had decided she was. A monster. A possession. A burden. But Elias had given her something no one else had. A choice. And as Mira watched the fire burn through the darkness, she quietly promised herself that she would never allow anyone to take that choice away from her again. The storm arrived just before dawn. Rain hammered against the roof of the abandoned mountain cabin while thunder rolled across the peaks. Elias woke suddenly, his hand reaching for the rifle beside him. Mira was already awake. She stood near the window, staring into the darkness. "What is it?" Elias whispered. Mira didn't answer. Then Elias heard it. Horses. Several of them. The traders had found them. Mira stepped away from the window. "They followed us." Elias slowly stood. His shoulder was still painful, but he ignored it. "How many?" "6." Elias looked around the cabin. There was only one entrance. They were trapped. Myra's eyes filled with fear. Elias noticed. He walked toward her. "Mira." She looked at him. "Listen to me." "What?" "No matter what happens, you are not going back with them." Her eyes widened. "You don't understand. There are 6 of them." "I understand. They will kill you." "Maybe." Mira stared at him. Elias gave her a small smile. "But I'm not planning to make it easy." The sound of boots approaching the cabin grew louder. Then someone shouted from outside. "Mira." She froze. The trader leader. His voice carried through the storm. "Come outside, girl." Myra's hands began to shake. Elias stepped in front of her. The leader continued. "You know you can't escape. Your human friend is injured. You have nowhere to go." Mira looked at Elias. "He's right." Elias shook his head. "He wants you to believe that. He has 6 men. And we have the cabin." Mira looked around. It was an old wooden building with broken furniture and a fireplace. "How does that help?" Elias pointed toward the back wall. "There is another exit." Mira stared. "Where?" Elias moved a wooden cabinet aside. Behind it was a narrow opening leading into the mountain. Myra's eyes widened. "You knew about this?" "I found it yesterday." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I wasn't sure where it went." Mira looked toward the front door. The traders were getting closer. Then she suddenly smiled. "Now we know." Elias understood. They had one chance. The front door exploded open. The trader leader stepped inside with 2 men behind him. "Enough games." His eyes found Mira. "There you are." Elias raised his rifle. The men immediately aimed their weapons. The leader laughed. "You're surrounded." Elias glanced at Mira. She nodded. Then Elias fired. The shot struck the lantern hanging beside the leader. The cabin suddenly went dark. Mira moved. She threw a handful of ashes from the fireplace into the air. The men shouted as they stumbled backward. Elias grabbed Myra's hand. "Run!" They disappeared through the hidden opening. Behind them, the traders fired blindly into the darkness. The bullets struck the wooden walls. Elias and Mira crawled through the narrow passage until they reached the other side of the mountain. But when they emerged, they stopped. The path ended at a massive cliff. Below them was a deep ravine. Behind them, the traders were coming. Mira looked left. Then right. Nothing. "We're trapped," she whispered. The leader appeared at the entrance of the passage. He was furious. "You should have come quietly." Mira stepped forward. "Why?" The man frowned. "Because you belong to us." Mira shook her head. "No. You were purchased. I was stolen." You worked for us. I was forced. The man's face darkened. You think this human will protect you forever? Mira glanced at Elias. Then she looked back at the leader. No. The man smiled. Mira continued. I don't need him to protect me forever. The smile disappeared. I only needed someone to remind me that I could protect myself. Elias looked at her with quiet pride. The leader raised his rifle. Enough. He aimed at Mira. Elias moved instantly. But Mira was faster. She threw a small stone at the man's hand. His rifle fell. At the same moment, Elias fired at the ground near the other men. The traders panicked. Mira grabbed a rope hanging from an old wooden post. She had noticed it earlier. Elias. He understood. Together, they pulled the rope. A large pile of loose rocks crashed down the mountain slope. The traders scattered. One man fell. Another dropped his weapon. The leader tried to escape, but the landslide blocked the passage behind him. Elias and Mira ran toward the opposite side of the ravine. They had survived. But the leader remained trapped. He stared at Mira through the falling rain. You'll regret this. Mira stopped. For years, those words would have frightened her. This time, they didn't. She looked at the man who had controlled her life. Then she smiled. No. She turned away. I regret that I was ever afraid of you. Elias and Mira continued down the mountain. Hours later, they reached a quiet valley. There, beneath a large pine tree, they finally stopped. Mira sat down. She was exhausted. Elias handed her a canteen. She drank and looked at him. You could have left me. Elias sat beside her. I could have. You could have handed me over in Red Creek. Yes. You could have escaped when I was being chased. Yes. Mira looked confused. Why didn't you? Elias looked toward the mountains. Because I know what it's like to have the world decide who you're supposed to be. Mira studied him. What do you mean? Elias was silent for a moment. Then he told her about his own past. He had grown up being judged by people who knew nothing about him. He had learned early that the world was quick to place people into boxes. Mira listened quietly. When he finished, she looked down at her hands. You understand me? Elias shook his head. Not completely. She looked at him. But I'm trying. Those 4 words touched Mira more deeply than any promise could have. That night, they built a small fire. For the first time since she had escaped, Mira slept without fear. And Elias stayed awake beside the fire, watching over her. By morning, they would begin searching for a new home. But neither knew that the greatest danger was still ahead. Because the trader leader had survived. And he was no longer chasing Mira simply to reclaim his property. Now he wanted revenge. 6 months had passed since Elias and Mira escaped the mountains. The frontier settlement they eventually found was small, peaceful, and surrounded by golden fields and tall pine forests. It was far from the traders who had once hunted Mira, and for the first time in years, she could wake each morning without wondering if someone was coming to take her away. Elias had bought a small piece of land on the edge of town. There was an old wooden cabin on it, a stable, and enough empty ground to grow crops. The cabin needed plenty of repairs, but Elias didn't mind. Neither did Mira. Together, they turned the abandoned property into a home. Mira learned to care for the horses and became known throughout the settlement for her incredible strength and patience. Elias taught her how to use a rifle, while she taught him how to track animals through the mountains. Slowly, the townspeople changed their opinions about her. At first, they had been afraid. Children hid when Mira walked past. Adults whispered behind her back. But Mira never responded with anger. She simply continued working. She helped an elderly farmer repair his broken fence. She carried heavy sacks for the shopkeeper. When a young boy fell from his horse, Mira was the first person to run toward him. Little by little, fear disappeared. People began to see Mira for who she really was. Not a monster. Not someone's property. Just Mira. One evening, Elias returned home after spending the entire day repairing a fence. He was exhausted. As he stepped inside the cabin, he smelled something delicious. He stopped. Mira? There was no answer. Elias followed the smell into the kitchen. Mira was standing beside the stove. She turned around. You're late. Elias smiled. I had work. You always have work. And you always complain. Mira smiled. I learned from you. Elias laughed. On the table was a large dinner. Fresh bread. Roasted vegetables. Beans. And a large plate of venison. Elias stared at the food. This is quite a meal. Mira crossed her arms. Sit down. Elias raised an eyebrow. Are you ordering me? Yes. He sat. Mira placed the food on the table. For a few moments, they ate quietly. Then Mira suddenly looked at him. Elias? Yes. She hesitated. Can I eat with you? Elias froze. The question brought back a memory. A cold evening. A lonely orc standing outside a tavern. A hungry woman who had been too afraid to enter. A simple question. Can I eat with you? Elias looked at Mira. She was smiling now. There was no fear in her eyes. No desperation. She was joking. Elias leaned back in his chair. No. Mira's smile disappeared. What? Elias tried to keep a straight face. No. Mira stared at him. Why? Elias pointed toward the chair beside him. Because you don't have to ask anymore. Mira looked at the empty chair. Then she looked back at him. Elias smiled. That chair is yours. Mira's expression softened. You mean it? Of course. She slowly sat down beside him. Elias pushed the bread toward her. Besides, you cooked the food. Mira laughed. That means I should get the biggest piece. Absolutely not. You're the one who said the chair was mine. The chair is yours. The venison is mine. Mira reached across the table and stole a piece. Elias stared at her. Mira. She smiled innocently. What? You just stole my dinner. I saved you from eating too much. Elias shook his head. For several seconds, they laughed together. Outside, the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The same mountains that had once been a place of danger now looked peaceful. Mira looked through the window. She remembered the woman she had been 6 months earlier. Hungry. Terrified. Alone. She remembered standing outside that tavern, wondering if anyone would let her sit at their table. She remembered Elias moving his plate aside. She remembered the chair. A simple wooden chair. At the time, she had thought Elias was only giving her a place to eat. But now she understood. He had given her something much more important. He had given her a place to belong. Mira looked at Elias. Thank you. He stopped eating. For what? For that night. Elias smiled. You were hungry. Mira shook her head. No. You don't understand. She placed her hand on the table. I had spent so long believing I was nothing. I thought I was only what other people said I was. Elias listened. But you didn't ask what I was, she continued. You didn't ask where I came from. You didn't care what I looked like. Her eyes became wet. You just saw that I was hungry. Elias reached across the table. His hand gently covered hers. That's all anyone should have to be. Mira smiled through her tears. A person. A person. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees. The world had not become perfect. There were still people who hated what they did not understand. There were still dangers beyond the mountains. But Mira no longer faced them alone. She had a home. She had a future. And she had someone who had once looked at a hungry stranger and simply said, "Sit down." Years later, people in the settlement would still remember the story. They would remember the day a hungry orc woman walked into a tavern and asked a lone Apache human if she could eat with him. They would remember how everyone expected Elias to reject her. But they would remember his reaction most of all. He didn't laugh. He didn't turn away. He didn't ask what she could give him in return. He simply pulled out a chair. And sometimes, Mira would tell the story herself. Whenever someone asked how her new life had begun, she would smile and say, "It began with a meal." Then she would look at Elias. And a man who understood that no one should ever have to ask permission to sit at the table. Elias would always smile. Because he knew the truth. That night, he thought he had simply fed a hungry stranger. But in giving Mira a place at his table, he had helped her find something she had been searching for all her life. A home. And, perhaps without realizing it, he had found one too.